I'm gonna make this very simple for you, Dan. Men should not play sports against women. I'm not gonna get into all the bullshit that's going on out here in the world today. If anybody thinks that, I think they're stupid. I'm not, like I say, I support the gay community 100%. I support the transgender community 100%. But I do not, under any circumstances, zero, think that men should play sports against women. And if anybody have a problem with that, they're going to have to get over it, because I'm not going to change my...
I saw a video of Enes Kanter saying that he's declaring himself as a WNBA prospect. So he posted this on his social media. He said, if simply declaring who you are is all that's required, then I meet every single requirement necessary to compete in the WNBA. And he basically says, based on the current guidelines, I can and am officially declaring my eligibility for the upcoming WNBA draft in April 2027. Like, I don't know whether to laugh. I don't know whether to cry, because like I've said in other videos, this league is the anything but basketball league. The storylines around this league are never about basketball. And I didn't realize what I was signing up for by covering this league to the extent that I have been covering it for the past 3 years. Like, I actually like sports. I don't want to talk about politics. I don't want to talk about drama and negativity. And it's literally, that's the thing that's in your face.
Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that a former NBA player has suddenly announced that he wants to enter the WNBA draft. At first, it sounds like nothing more than an internet stunt. But then another former NBA name makes a similar declaration, and suddenly what looked like a joke starts raising a much bigger question. What exactly are the rules, and who gets to decide who qualifies? The controversy has pulled Charles Barkley, Enes Kanter Freedom, Royce White, Sophie Cunningham, Cheryl Reeve, and the WNBA into one of the most explosive debates surrounding women's basketball. And while social media has turned the entire situation into a battlefield, there is something much more important underneath all the noise.
Oh my gosh, it's happening. A former NBA star has now declared himself a prospect for the WNBA. This is Enes Kanter Freedom. He is 6'10", 250 pounds. He now says that he has reviewed all of the eligibility requirements and criteria for the WNBA and has decided to declare himself eligible for the 2027 WNBA draft.
Yo, shit just got real, y'all. If this is true, Enes Kanter Freedom said, you know what? It's time for the WNBA to put up or shut up. They want to talk about, they believe inclusivity and exclusion is never the answer, and there's not even a number big enough of people other than women, other than biological women who are playing in women's sports for it to matter, for all this fuss and all this, you know, all these people to be looking at it like a problem. Shit just got real.
Because this isn't simply about one player trying to make a roster. It's about whether a league can clearly define its own rules before someone decides to test them. And now the pressure is building. For years, the debate surrounding professional women's basketball has been about much more than what happens between the lines. Questions about eligibility, fairness, inclusion, physical differences, and the future of women's sports have repeatedly collided. And every time the conversation seems to calm down, something new pushes it back into the spotlight. This time, the spark came from an unexpected place. A former NBA player publicly announced that he intended to pursue the WNBA draft, presenting the idea as a test of the league's own standards. The announcement immediately spread across social media.
Consideration and reviewing the current eligibility guidelines, I am officially declaring myself a WNBA prospect. If simply declaring who you are is all that's required, then I meet every single requirement necessary to compete in the WNBA. My team and I have carefully examined the WNBA's eligibility criteria and governing framework surrounding self-identification and inclusion. Based on the current guidelines, I can and am officially declaring my eligibility for the upcoming WNBA draft in May 2027.
Where some people treated it as an obvious joke, while others argued that it exposed a serious weakness in the way sports organizations communicate their eligibility policies. That former NBA player was Enes Kanter Freedom. Kanter Freedom is no stranger to controversy. During his NBA career, and especially after leaving the league, he became known for speaking loudly about political and social issues.
Announcement. I'm transgender. I'm a woman. I identify as sometimes identifying as a woman for purposes of basketball, professional basketball. So I'll be declaring for the WNBA draft in 2027.
Only thing I want to say is what happened to the people that made content, the people that wore t-shirts that wanted men to play with women. Where did they go? I've been looking for them. People, hey, where's Cheryl Reeve at with some t-shirts? Where them content creators at, man? This would be such a good idea if Caitlin Clark had him as a teammate. Where y'all go now? Y'all been real quiet around here, bro. Real quiet. What the hell is going on?
He built a reputation around challenging institutions, criticizing powerful organizations, and deliberately putting uncomfortable questions in front of the public. So when he released his WNBA declaration, many people immediately wondered whether this was simply another publicity stunt. But the way he presented it made the story more complicated. Instead of turning the announcement into a simple comedy sketch, he framed it as a challenge. His argument was essentially this: if an organization says that identity and inclusion are important considerations, then those principles should be applied consistently. That distinction became the center of the controversy. The announcement wasn't really about whether Cantor Freedom believed he was going to walk onto a WNBA court and become a star overnight. The bigger question was whether a professional sports league should have clearly defined eligibility standards that leave little room for interpretation. And that question landed at exactly the right or wrong time, because the WNBA was already dealing with a larger conversation about transgender athletes and women's sports. The league had become increasingly visible, and so had the arguments surrounding its players, coaches, and policies. Supporters of inclusion argued that transgender people should not be singled out or treated as a threat. Critics argued that professional women's sports exist precisely because biological differences can affect athletic competition and that eligibility rules therefore need to protect competitive fairness. Both sides believed they were defending an important principle. And that is what made Cantor Freedom's move so effective as a piece of controversy. He wasn't simply criticizing the WNBA from the outside. He was attempting to turn the league's own stated principles into a question it would have to answer. If the league rejected him, critics could argue that there were additional requirements beyond identity. If the league accepted the premise, critics could ask whether the same standard would apply to every person who made a similar declaration. That was the trap, and social media immediately understood it. Clips of the announcement began circulating across platforms, with supporters calling it a clever pressure test and opponents accusing him of making a serious issue into a political stunt. The arguments became increasingly heated. Some people focused on fairness in athletics. Others focused on transgender rights. Others weren't interested in the policy question at all and simply saw the entire situation as another example of the internet turning professional sports into a culture war battlefield. But then something happened that made the story even bigger. Another former NBA player entered the conversation. Royce White, a former first-round NBA pick, made his own announcement about pursuing the WNBA draft. Suddenly, what had looked like one former player's provocative statement had become a pattern. And that changed the entire conversation. One person could be dismissed as a comedian, provocateur, or former athlete looking for attention. Two former professional basketball players making similar declarations within a short period of time were much harder for audiences to ignore. White's announcement brought another wave of reactions. Some people laughed. Some people were furious. Some argued that both men were deliberately exposing what they believed was an inconsistency in the debate. Others argued that the entire premise was disrespectful because it reduced a complicated discussion about transgender athletes to a viral stunt. And while all of those arguments were happening online, the central question remained surprisingly simple. What are the actual eligibility rules? That's where this story becomes more interesting than the viral clips. Sports leagues cannot operate entirely on slogans. They need regulations. They need standards. They need procedures for determining who can compete. And when those rules become the subject of public controversy, vague statements about inclusion or fairness aren't always enough. Fans want to know exactly where the line is. Players want to know what the rules mean. Teams need to know who is eligible. And leagues need to be able to defend their policies consistently. That is why the Cantor Freedom controversy gained so much attention. Whether someone agrees with his argument or completely rejects it, the tactic forced people to look beyond the headline. The question wasn't simply, should this former NBA player be allowed to play in the WNBA? The deeper question was, what standards should determine eligibility in women's professional basketball? And those are two very different questions. The first is about one individual. The second is about an entire sporting system. That distinction is important because social media tends to collapse complicated issues into one sentence. One side says, "This proves the rules are ridiculous." The other says, "This is just a publicity stunt." But neither statement fully explains why the controversy became so large. The reason is that the WNBA was already experiencing an enormous increase in attention. More viewers were watching. More personalities were speaking publicly. More athletes were building individual brands. And every controversial statement could spread globally within minutes. A comment that might once have disappeared after a television interview could now become a headline, a short-form clip, a reaction video, and a political talking point before the day was over. Cantor Freedom understood that environment perfectly. He knew that the announcement would not remain a simple social media post. He knew people would debate it. He knew critics would attack it. He knew supporters would defend it. And most importantly, he knew the conversation would force people to discuss the underlying issue. That is why the story became much larger than one former NBA player. But there was still another piece missing. For years, Charles Barkley has been one of the loudest voices in basketball when it comes to controversial sports debates. Barkley has never been known for carefully avoiding uncomfortable subjects. When he believes something is wrong, he usually says it directly. And his position on men's and women's sports has been consistent. He has argued that biological differences matter in athletic competition and that men's professional athletes should not simply be placed into women's professional sports. That position immediately put him on a collision course with the broader debate. But Barkley's involvement wasn't important simply because he was famous. It mattered because he has spent decades inside professional basketball. He understands the physical demands of elite competition. He understands how much separates an NBA-level athlete from an average person. And he understands why women's professional sports were created as a separate competitive environment. So when Barkley criticized the idea of men competing against women, his comments were immediately picked up by sports audiences far beyond the WNBA's normal fan base. Now the controversy had everything required for a viral story. Former NBA players, a women's professional league, a transgender eligibility debate, a major basketball personality, and a question that neither side seemed willing to answer in exactly the same way. But this was only the beginning. Because once the argument moved from social media into mainstream sports commentary, the issue became much harder to contain. And the next voices to enter the conversation would make the debate even more explosive. What happened next is what transformed the story from an unusual internet controversy into a much bigger sports debate. As clips of Enes Kanter Freedom and Royce White continued spreading, the conversation moved away from the two former NBA players and toward the people who actually had influence inside professional basketball. And one name kept coming up: Charles Barkley. Barkley has never been the type of commentator to hide behind carefully worded statements. Throughout his career, he has built his public personality around saying what he believes, even when he knows the reaction will be intense. And on the subject of men's and women's sports, his position has been remarkably direct. He has argued that biological differences matter in athletic competition and that men should not compete against women in professional sports. For Barkley, the issue isn't about whether someone deserves respect. It's about competitive fairness. That distinction became extremely important because the debate was quickly becoming emotionally charged. One side accused critics of transgender participation of attacking transgender people themselves. The other side argued that supporting someone's personal rights does not automatically mean supporting every possible eligibility decision in competitive sports. Barkley repeatedly emphasized that those two questions should not be treated as identical. Someone can believe that transgender people deserve dignity and equal treatment while also believing that professional sports require separate eligibility standards. That argument became one of the most repeated points throughout the controversy. But then Barkley took aim at the bigger issue: the rules. According to the argument being made by critics, a professional sports league has to be able to explain its eligibility standards clearly. If the league believes that identity should play a role in determining eligibility, then people will naturally ask what the exact boundaries are. If there are additional athletic or medical requirements, then those requirements should also be clearly explained. And if the rules are unclear, someone will eventually test them. That is precisely what Kanter Freedom appeared to be doing. Instead of simply complaining about the policy from the outside, He created a scenario that forced people to ask what would happen if someone actually tried to use the policy. That is why the announcement received so much attention. It turned an abstract argument into a hypothetical situation everyone could understand. Imagine a former NBA player walking into a professional women's basketball draft and saying, "I'm eligible. What happens next? Does the league simply reject the application? If so, on what exact rule? Does the league review the player's eligibility individually? If so, what criteria are used? And if the player argues that those criteria contradict the league's public statements about inclusion, how does the league respond?" Those questions are much harder to answer than a simple social media statement. And that's where the controversy became a policy debate. But there was another factor making the situation even more complicated. The WNBA already had an ongoing argument surrounding players and coaches who had publicly discussed transgender participation in sports. Sophie Cunningham had become one of the most visible players associated with the debate after expressing her position on protecting women's competition. Her comments generated an enormous response. Supporters said she was speaking about competitive fairness. Critics accused her of contributing to an environment that could be hostile toward transgender athletes. The disagreement quickly spread beyond Cunningham herself. It involved coaches, players, fans, media personalities, and eventually politicians and commentators who normally had little to do with women's basketball. One of the most discussed figures on the other side was Cheryl Reeve. Reeve, a highly respected basketball coach, publicly emphasized inclusion and argued that transgender athletes should not automatically be treated as the biggest problem facing women's sports. Her comments reflected a completely different philosophy from Barkley's. Instead of starting with biological differences, the emphasis was on inclusion and the protection of transgender people from discrimination. And this is where the debate became much more complicated, because both sides were now talking about different definitions of fairness. One side asked, "How do we make competition fair?" The other asked, "How do we make participation fair?" Those questions can overlap, but they don't always produce the same answer. And that is why social media arguments about the subject became so explosive. People weren't simply disagreeing about basketball. They were disagreeing about what fairness itself means. Then Stephen A. Smith entered the discussion. And anyone familiar with Stephen A. knows that he wasn't going to quietly tiptoe around the subject. He criticized the idea that biological differences should simply be ignored when discussing professional women's sports. At the same time, he also pushed back against the idea that questioning sports eligibility automatically means someone hates transgender people. His position was essentially that the sports conversation deserves to be treated separately from personal attacks. That distinction is important because online discussions often turn into accusations almost immediately. A person raises a question about competitive advantage, and someone responds that they are attacking a particular group. Another person argues for inclusion, and critics accuse them of ignoring women's sports. The result is a conversation where people stop debating the actual policy and start debating each other's motives. And once that happens, finding common ground becomes much harder. The Cantor Freedom controversy exposed exactly that problem. Because regardless of whether people considered his announcement serious or satirical, it created a scenario that demanded a concrete answer. It was no longer enough to say that the league supports inclusion. People wanted to know, inclusion under what rules? And that question followed the WNBA everywhere. Television discussions picked it up. Sports podcasts picked it up. Social media creators picked it up. Political commentators picked it up. Even people who normally didn't follow women's basketball suddenly had an opinion. That created a strange situation. The league's growing popularity was bringing it more attention than ever before, but that attention also meant every controversial issue was magnified. A single comment could dominate the news cycle. A single clip could generate millions of views. A single disagreement between two personalities could become a national argument. And that is exactly what happened here. But then the debate took another turn. Instead of remaining focused on whether former NBA players should actually be eligible, people started asking whether the entire controversy was fair to transgender athletes themselves. Critics of Cantor Freedom argued that the stunt reduced a complicated issue into a punchline. They pointed out that transgender athletes are real people and that debates about their participation can have serious consequences. From that perspective, Deliberately declaring eligibility for a women's league without genuinely identifying as transgender could be seen as mocking the entire conversation. Supporters of Cantor Freedom saw it differently. They argued that the purpose wasn't to ridicule transgender people. They argued that the purpose was to expose what they believed was a contradiction in the policy debate. And that disagreement created another dividing line. Was this satire? Was it activism? Was it political theater? Or was it simply a publicity stunt? There wasn't one universal answer. Different audiences saw completely different things. For some viewers, it was hilarious. For others, it was offensive. For others, it was a legitimate policy challenge. And for many people, it was simply another example of professional sports becoming entangled in America's larger cultural battles. Then came the reaction from the WNBA players' side. The players' union emphasized that transgender people should not be subjected to hate, abuse, or demonization. That response made sense from the union's perspective. Professional athletes were watching the conversation become increasingly hostile online, and the union wanted to make it clear that disagreement over sports policy should not turn into harassment. But critics argued that this still didn't answer the underlying question. You can condemn harassment. You can reject hateful behavior. You can support individual dignity. But none of those positions automatically determine the eligibility rules for a professional sports league. And that distinction became one of the most important themes in the entire controversy. The conversation was no longer just, should these two former NBA players be allowed to enter the WNBA? It had become, what should the rules of women's professional basketball actually be? That is a much larger question. And there is another reason the controversy became so powerful. The people involved had enormous audiences. Cantor Freedom already had a large following. Royce White had a political audience in addition to his basketball background. Barkley has decades of credibility among sports fans. Stephen A. Smith has one of the largest platforms in sports commentary. And the WNBA itself was experiencing a period of unprecedented visibility. Put all of those audiences together, and the result was almost guaranteed to become enormous. But the biggest problem for everyone involved was that the conversation had become almost impossible to control. Every new statement created another headline. Every headline produced another reaction. Every reaction produced another video. And every video brought another wave of arguments. The original basketball question was disappearing underneath layers of politics, identity, culture, and outrage. And that is when the controversy became something much bigger than a former NBA player declaring for a women's league. It became a test of whether professional sports organizations can create policies that satisfy competing demands for fairness, inclusion, and competitive integrity. Because once a rule is written, someone will eventually challenge it. And when that challenge comes from a person with an NBA resume, millions of followers, and a willingness to take the argument directly to the public, the league cannot simply ignore it. But there was still one question hanging over everything. Were these declarations actually capable of creating a legal problem for the WNBA? Or was the entire lawsuit narrative simply another layer of internet exaggeration surrounding a controversy that was never as simple as the viral headlines made it appear? That question would become the next major battle. By this point, the controversy had moved far beyond one viral announcement. The biggest question was no longer whether NS Cantor Freedom or Royce White were serious about entering the WNBA. The real question was whether their declarations had exposed a weakness in the broader conversation about eligibility in women's professional sports. And that is where the legal argument became important. Whenever a professional league establishes eligibility requirements, those requirements have to be applied consistently. A league cannot simply create rules after a controversy begins and expect everyone to accept the decision without asking questions. At the same time, an athlete declaring themselves eligible does not automatically create a legal right to enter a professional draft. That distinction is critical. A declaration is not the same thing as acceptance. A former NBA player can say they want to enter a league, but the league still has procedures, contractual requirements, eligibility standards, and organizational authority. So while social media may have described the situation as a lawsuit or legal war, the reality is more complicated. The most important battle was actually happening in the court of public opinion. Every side wanted to control the narrative. Supporters of Cantor Freedom argued that he had exposed an obvious contradiction. Critics argued that he was deliberately turning a serious issue into entertainment. Supporters of inclusion said transgender athletes should not become targets for political attacks. Critics of the current approach said protecting women's sports requires clearly defined standards. And somewhere in the middle was the WNBA itself. The league had to deal with an impossible communications problem. If officials responded aggressively, they risked giving the controversy even more attention. If they ignored it, critics could argue that the league was avoiding the question. If they issued a detailed explanation, they would have to defend every part of that explanation. And if the rules changed, people would immediately ask why they had not been clear from the beginning. That is the difficult position every major sports organization faces when an old policy suddenly becomes the center of a national debate. The controversy also exposed another reality about modern sports. The athletes are no longer the only people creating the story. Fans create stories. Commentators create stories. Influencers create stories. Former players create stories. And sometimes a 30-second social media video can generate more attention than an entire week of games. That changes the way leagues have to operate. The WNBA has grown dramatically in visibility, and with that growth comes an enormous amount of scrutiny. Every decision is analyzed. Every statement is clipped. Every disagreement becomes content. And every controversial subject can be transformed into a political argument almost instantly. That is exactly what happened here. The original question was about eligibility, but soon people were debating free speech, then transgender rights, then women's sports, then political ideology, then the media, and eventually the entire argument became another battle in America's culture war. That is why Charles Barkley's comments became so significant. Barkley wasn't simply another person reacting to a viral video. He represented a generation of basketball players who had spent decades inside the professional game. His message was straightforward. Respect for individuals and rules for athletic competition can exist at the same time. Whether someone agrees with that position or not, it is an argument that deserves to be discussed separately from personal attacks. And that may be the biggest lesson from the entire controversy. You can disagree with someone's sports policy without questioning their humanity. You can support transgender people while still debating how professional sports should handle eligibility. You can believe women's sports deserve protection without believing that transgender people should be treated with hostility. And you can criticize a league's policies without attacking every athlete who plays in that league. Unfortunately, social media rarely rewards that kind of nuance. Outrage travels faster. Anger gets more clicks. And the strongest possible statement often receives more attention than the most accurate one. That is why stories like this can become distorted so quickly. One person says something controversial. Someone else posts a reaction. A third person creates a headline. Then another account repeats the headline as fact. Within hours, the original context can disappear completely. That is especially dangerous when the subject involves real people and potentially serious legal or reputational consequences. The phrase Charles Barkley sues the WNBA sounds enormous, but a headline is not evidence. The same applies to claims about sponsors abandoning the league, lawyers preparing lawsuits, or officials secretly changing eligibility rules. Those claims need verification before they should be treated as established facts. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because regardless of whether a courtroom ever becomes involved, the controversy has already achieved what the people behind it wanted. People are talking. People are asking questions. People who had never thought about professional women's basketball eligibility are suddenly discussing it. And the WNBA has been forced to confront a subject that is difficult to explain in a single sentence. That may be the real impact of the entire situation. Not a lawsuit, not a draft pick, not a roster spot, but pressure. Pressure on the league to define its policies. Pressure on commentators to explain their positions. Pressure on athletes to decide whether they want to speak publicly. And pressure on fans to separate legitimate disagreement from personal attacks. There is also another uncomfortable reality. The more attention this controversy receives, the less attention goes toward basketball itself. Instead of discussing playoff races, performances, coaching decisions, defensive schemes, and rising stars, sports media can spend an entire day debating a statement made on social media. That may generate enormous engagement, but it doesn't necessarily help the sport. And that is where Charles Barkley's broader criticism becomes relevant. If a league wants to be taken seriously as a professional sports organization, the basketball has to remain the center of the conversation. Controversy may attract viewers. Politics may generate clicks. Arguments may dominate social media. But ultimately, fans come to watch basketball. They want to see players compete. They want to see records broken. They want rivalries. They want championships. They want stories that happen on the court. The challenge for the WNBA is figuring out how to handle controversial issues without allowing those issues to completely consume the identity of the league. And that won't be easy, because this debate is not going away simply because one viral moment disappears. Questions about transgender participation, competitive fairness, women's sports, and eligibility policies are being discussed across professional and amateur athletics. Different leagues are taking different approaches. Different countries have different regulations. And different athletes have very different opinions. There is no single sentence that will make everyone happy. That means organizations have to create policies that are specific, transparent, and understandable. The clearer the rules are, the less room there is for confusion. And the less confusion there is, the harder it becomes for anyone to turn uncertainty into a controversy. That may ultimately be the biggest takeaway from the Cantor Freedom and Royce White declarations. Their strategy, whether you see it as clever activism, political theater, satire, or simple publicity, forced a much larger conversation. And now the question is whether the people running professional sports are willing to answer that conversation with actual policy rather than slogans. Because the internet will move on eventually. Another controversy will take its place. Another viral clip will dominate the timeline. Another athlete will say something unexpected. But the underlying policy questions will remain. And if the WNBA wants to avoid facing the same controversy again, the solution isn't another viral response. It's clarity, clear rules, clear eligibility standards, clear communication, and a commitment to treating every athlete involved with basic dignity, even when people strongly disagree. As for Charles Barkley, NS Cantor Freedom, Royce White, and everyone else who has entered the debate, their statements have already accomplished one thing. They made people pay attention. Now the responsibility belongs to the institutions themselves. Because once millions of people start asking what the rules actually are, eventually someone has to answer. And perhaps the most ironic part of the entire controversy is that the basketball itself became almost secondary. A story that began with a former NBA player making a provocative declaration turned into a national argument about identity, fairness, sports policy, and free speech. Whether you think the entire thing is ridiculous or believe it raises legitimate questions, one thing is undeniable. The debate has become much bigger than one player. And until the rules are clearly understood, the argument isn't going away. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think this entire controversy exposed a genuine problem with unclear sports eligibility rules? Or do you think the former NBA players were simply using a serious issue to create attention? Should professional women's basketball leagues have completely clear, specific eligibility standards that leave no room for interpretation? And what do you make of Charles Barkley's position? Drop your opinion in the comments, because this debate clearly isn't going away anytime soon. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And most importantly, keep the conversation respectful. You can strongly disagree with someone without attacking them personally. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.